Yes, the introduction is 2022. Yeah, great. Thanks.
Can you hear me? Oh, yeah, okay. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. And thank you to everyone who's joining us online as well. My name is Rachel South, and I manage the bookshop at Pushkin House, and I am delighted to welcome Robert Chandler and Catherine Brown for tonight's event. I'm just going to say a couple of words about Robert and Catherine, and then we can get started. Robert Chandler is one of the most eminent translators of Russian language literature of our time. His translations include many works by Andrei Platonov, Vasily Grossman, and of course Teffi. And he's here tonight to present the 5th volume of Teffi's stories, which he's translated with Elizabeth Chandler and their colleagues. Robert is a long-time friend of Pushkin House, and as well as hosting many literary events here, including his translation of Platon's Chevengur earlier this year, he formerly ran the monthly translation workshops at Pushkin House. Catherine Brown is Professor of English and Director of the Graduate Research School at Northeastern University, London. Her research is in the fields of modernism, Anglo-Russian literary relations, D.H. Lawrence studies, and more recently, vegan literary studies. For Literary Review, she reviewed Teffi's Subtly Worded and Memories from Moscow to the Black Sea, as well as Edith Halber's biography, Teffi, A Life of Letters and of Laughter. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the event.
Okay, I'm kicking off, and I think I'll stand, and I think I'll make use of this, if that's all right. So I'm privileged to have been invited to help bring this book to birth to an Anglophone audience. My qualification is only really an interest in Russia and Russian literature, and as has just been said, the fact that I've reviewed a few of the previous volumes of Teffi. I was very glad that Robert gave me several months' notice of this talk, and at the moment he invited me, I kind of re-immersed myself into Teffi, which was wonderful. And then life happened. I happen to be on maternity leave at the moment. I also had to prepare a talk on D.H. Lawrence that I gave in Southall Minster a couple of weeks ago. And one thing after another happened, and then suddenly I turned a page in my diary, and I saw next week the talk on Teffi. And this slight frisson that now I really did need to re-immerse myself very quickly in Teffi reminded me of one of my favourite anecdotes from Memories, which those of you who've read it, if you have also ever spoken in public, will also have stuck in your memory, that Teffi is approached by a young man and invited to give a little speech about the new cinema. And despite the fact that the new cinema and the modernist short story were born at the same time and very much influenced each other in their birth, along with snapshot photography, Teffi has absolutely nothing whatsoever to say about the new cinema, and she says so and refuses the invitation. But then, when it's pointed out that this talk is a full 6 weeks away, she reckons that, well, she can think herself into this topic in that time. And also, in that time, she might have a stroke or there might be a revolution. Who knows what can happen in 6 weeks? That's quite a long time. And having accepted, she promptly forgets all about it. And then she decides one evening to go and check in on a production of one of her plays, because she has discovered that if she doesn't, then by the time she does go and see one of her plays, it's a kind of an amusing farce with an oddly familiar ring to it. So much do the actors change the text. So she realizes it's time to check in on one of her plays, but when she turns up, instead of the house lights being down, they are up, and there is a table with green baize on it, and there are several luminaries of the age sitting at this table. And there is an oddly familiar young man sitting at one end of the table who spots her in the audience and quickly inserts himself in the chair next to her and asks her whether she wants to speak before or after the interval. And then the narrative speeds up. It's very compressed. This wonderful anecdote is then dealt with in about a paragraph. So it must all have occurred in something of a blur, that she makes her way out of the theatre. She must somehow have shaken off this guy. Passes an enormous poster in which this event of ruminations on the new cinema is advertised with her name very prominently there. She makes her way back to her flat. She takes the phone off the hook. Interesting detail that she has a phone. She does what we all fantasize doing in these situations, or insofar as this situation has ever occurred to any of us to any degree. This is a pretty extreme degree. She goes to bed and puts her head under the pillow. Supper is ready, but she is too scared, and this is a wonderful detail and so relatable, too scared to come out into the dining room to eat, because the dining room is somehow closer to the world of this event about the new cinema that's going on at the Litchini Theatre. Anyway, fortunately, we didn't quite reach that extremity. So I would like to start by saying Happy Easter. 2 mornings ago, I was in St Sophia's Cathedral on Moscow Road, Bayswater. And I have to say that though I'm not Orthodox, and my husband is Greek, which is why we were there, and I don't always find Orthodoxy especially accessible to my Anglican soul, the fact that I had recently been re-immersing me in Teffi really did make an awful lot more sense of things. And as Robert has pointed out in one of his introductions, Teffi is a writer of leitmotifs, and there are individual leitmotifs for individual of her stories and essays, but there are also certain leitmotifs that run through her works. So just as Christmas keeps recurring in Tennyson's In Memoriam, Easters keep recurring to Teffi. And I suppose that is a difference between someone brought up in an Anglican world and someone brought up in an Orthodox world, with the vastly greater significance of Easter within Orthodoxy. And some of you may remember from Subtly Worded, A Radiant Easter. That, however, is not that religious a work despite its name. It's a kind of rectilinear moral fable where man hands on misery to man, just as occurs in The Forged Coupon by Tolstoy. But then we have Holy Saturday, which is an incident in Memories. So during the turmoil of, I think it's during the Civil War, she is with some other people. They hear the bells ringing out, and somebody remembers that the bells are ringing for Holy Saturday. In other words, Christ is risen. And it's one of these moments when a religious moment, which of course recurs year after year, and in this case is about the very fact of resurrection, recalls people out of tragic circumstances, rather like, again, Christmas recalled people to something greater during the First World War. And so she is then recalled in her mind to her childhood, to all the Holy Saturdays of her childhood, and in particular her relationship with her beloved younger sister Liana, and then tells us at the very end of this reminiscence that it was 3 years later in 1922 that she discovered on that very night, Holy Saturday, Liana had died. And she hadn't known at the time, but in the context of what is obviously a very live Orthodox Christian faith on the part of Teffi, that death is contextualized by this resurrection that takes place on Holy Saturday. So, Happy Easter, everyone. As this is a book launch, I'll just make one observation about this latest book, although I'm sure Robert will have vastly more to say about it, which is the organisation, which is a strikingly new thing about this book. So, Subtly Worded was organised chronologically by date of writing. Rasputin and Other Ironies was thematically arranged and by type. And Other Worlds was arranged by date of publication of the collection from which these various stories were taken. So this has got an organisation which is in chronological order by subject matter rather than by date of writing. And what this means is, I have to say, I skipped through immediately that I started reading one of these stories. I skipped to the end in order to see what year it was written. But you could always play the game with yourself of not doing that. And as you read through Another Reminiscence of Childhood, for example, ask yourself, was this written 20 years after the event? Was this written 40 years after the event? And I have to say, I think it would be hard to tell. Robert is very immersed in Teffi, and he probably would be able to tell, but it's not an easy game to play. And I think that tells us something about Teffi's extraordinary memory and the vividness of her imagination, which partners with her memory in recreating these times. It also, this organization, and I should say each of these sections has a ruminative introduction by Robert to kind of reorientate us to a new chapter, as it were, in Teffi's life. I should say there's just one section that's not chronological, which is on other worlds, as in the other separate volume, Other Worlds, and that is inserted between childhood and revolution. And I think it was very justly placed there to mediate these two, in some ways, incommensurable things, just as it is incommensurable that war or revolution should ever affect a childhood. But anyway, he introduces them, but then the very ordering itself serves as an introduction to Teffi, which is therefore, I would say, extremely welcoming for first-time readers. I doubt that anybody here is a first-time reader, but you know, maybe there are some, and perhaps that was what was intended with this new volume. And it isn't just this particular selection, this editing, this ordering, this curating, which is hospitable to the outsider. I would say Teffi herself is extraordinarily hospitable to outsiders. She takes an English woman, or an Anglo-German woman in my case in 2024, and inserts her into 1900 in the Russian provinces, as it might be. And immediately I feel at home. I don't feel that I don't know what I'm doing, or I don't know what's going on. And she wasn't writing for me, after all, in very many senses. Occasionally she's self-conscious about this. So at the beginning of the story, Witch, she says, were people really like that? Was life really like that? Needless to say, you couldn't ever talk about all this to a foreigner. He wouldn't understand, and he wouldn't believe a word you said. And this is, of course, in very questionable faith, but she is raising the issue. She is marking the fact that there is an extraordinary gap, and read at a surface level, very much underestimating her ability to make you believe that these things happened. Now, I think her contemporary, Georgy Adamovich, was a lot more just when, as Robert quotes in one of his introductions, he says, describes Teffi as a unique phenomenon in Russian literature, a true miracle that, and this is the bit that's relevant to this evening, people will still be wondering at in 100 years' time, crying and laughing at once. And it's not just that she takes us in and makes us feel at home in the foreign country that might be Russia to us, but also the foreign country that is childhood. So with my own very little Aurora and my also rather little Vera and Oksana, who are 2.5, and who currently have an obsession with Frozen, and identify respectively with Anna and Elsa, 2 characters from that Disney musical, that passionate self-identification, which is not to be belittled. I'm helped in understanding it by, for example, rereading my first Tolstoy. So if anybody wants to get in touch with childhood again, or know how to be with children, I think reading Teffi is a good place to go. I was also, when I was rereading Teffi, thinking back to the story Subtly Worded, which is, of course, the title story of that first volume, Subtly Worded, which, just to remind you, is about the way in which one had to write in order to not get people executed if they were in the Soviet Union in the early days of the Civil War, and the way in which they had to write to you if you were in the West. This subtle wording, which inverts reality, which is a nonsense, which reads as crazy, it's dazzling, this little story, because it is enacting one thing whilst enacting its opposite. It is precisely describing the kind of inverted speech that was necessary, and in doing so provides a true picture of a feature of the time. And in a way, all of her writing is aversive to that, is counter to that kind of speech. Also, that particular story reminds me of my Greek mother-in-law, who was in England because of the dictatorship, and she was trying to help the resistance, and so she was sending letters, which was meant to be coordinating the resistance within Athens, and she did this not only in code, but with invisible ink, and this was extremely laborious to do. And not until years later, when she'd moved back to Athens after the fall of the dictatorship, did she discover that these letters were just being opened and blank paper was discovered and nobody knew that there was anything on them, and people were rather bemused by it. That is something that Teffi would have described wonderfully. So again, her writings are the opposite of such blankness. Now, I would say she not only brings us to a child's perspective, she also makes us feel very close to animals. It was mentioned that I've recently become very interested in the world of vegan literary criticism. And so when animals occur in fiction, I notice. But even if you're not someone who's particularly animal-orientated, it can't but strike you on the forehead when you read Solovki, the story of the pilgrimage to the monastery, that the major characters are the gulls who accompany the pilgrim boat when it sets off from Arkhangelsk. And the monk who is in charge of this boat, he's at the tiller, and his cries are like gull cries. And so the gulls mediate. They, for a start, make the pilgrims who are from inside the country feel that they're stepping into a foreign country, which is the sea. So they are more at home there than the pilgrims are. But then it is the gulls who greet, the gulls as well as the monks, who greet the pilgrims once they arrive on the shore. And the monks are thin and the gulls are fat. And in fact, they are like geese. And they are so much to the manor born, they are so much at home there that one walks round them. The gulls do not move for you. But they also cooperate with the people. And there is one scene with a woman with a child on her back and a gull with a child on her back. The gulls are always gendered, and this is particularly striking when translated into English, because an animal, a gull, would normally be an it, but never in the story. So these two women are facing each other with their children on their backs and are teasing each other. And finally, the ultimate embrace of animals in this story comes when the character who kind of self-exorcises by the end of it, by having a kind of explosive epiphany, if that's the word, in a church, and is finally absolved and is given communion whilst she's having this breakdown, and she is full of love for the world and for the gulls, the dear gulls. So the gulls are in the first sentence and the last sentence, and they very much cooperate with humanity. And we see the kind of theology underlying this vision also in the story A Quiet Backwater, where you've got a kind of decayed estate with a couple living on it, along with a mare and a couple of other animals. They are also described as the souls of this estate. And the laundress, prompted by someone else's names day, launches into a disquisition on the names days of the various animals, and it turns out every species has its own names day. And the glowworm has its names day. And not only animals, but plants do. And berries, red berries have their names day. And the earth itself has a names day. And on the names day, you must not hurt or offend this animal or these berries or the face of the earth in any way at all. It actually reminded me of reading the Old Testament and the Jewish idea of a jubilee, when one lets the earth alone or one lets animals alone. And so this vision is clearly part of a strain in orthodoxy, which Robert brings out, again, in parts of his introductions. And that's rather different to the motivation behind the animal turn, which is recognized as an important feature of modernism. I mean, my own main man, D.H. Lawrence, turned to animals in the 1920s. Many of the titles of his works from the 1920s are named for animals, but he was doing so in a post-Darwinian context in which humanity was looking at itself and saying, okay, to what extent are we animal? Are we any different from animals? And if so, in what way? But this was a very, very live question at this time. And I'm not saying that that's irrelevant to Teffi, but it's clear that orthodoxy is part of, and a certain strain of animal-orientated theology is part of her context too. And some people, I know there is a strain of animal-orientated literary critic who would say that she anthropomorphizes, that she stresses the similarities rather than the otherness of animals. And I would say that a certain strain of criticism could easily go too far in the othering direction and fetishize the otherness of animals, when given that in a sense we are all animals, why on earth should one not, in fact, by contrast, stress, similarity, stress, commonality, stress, the ability to interact. And that's something that she definitely does. Before I finish, I'd just like to point to one piece that is being released for the first time in this collection, and which struck me not quite dumb, but I think I was probably a bit slack-jawed when I read it. It was so unlike anything I had read by her, pretty much unique in anything I've read at all, and I'd like to put Robert on the spot and ask him if he can guess which one it is.
Are you talking about her response to her obituary?
Actually, no. Actually, not that. You see, this goes to show how many extraordinary things, publicly, for the first time being translated, there are in this book. No, it's the story Guillotine, which to me was quite other. So it's, doesn't mess about with its title. The author it makes me think of is Kafka. This is Teffi at her most Kafkaesque. Most extraordinary, written 1918. A friend drops round for supper, and Teffi says, well, why don't you stay overnight? And the friend can't, because she's being executed tomorrow, she's being guillotined. And the narrator says, well, so am I. So why don't you stay? So they stay, and then the next day they need to take a taxi to go there, and the taxi is jacking up the fares because everybody is going to be executed. So you have to bargain with the taxi driver, and then it turns out that the organisation is a mess, and the queues are far longer than they ought to be, and they're all asking each other, what do we pay our taxes for? How long is this going to take? And some people queue jump, some people pay bribes to get to the front of the queue faster. We're coming. It ends. So that is the nightmare. That is the nightmare which is, well, one laughs, and there is that funniness to it, but it is thoroughly a nightmare, a live nightmare. But here we have perhaps this grace, but grace under extreme strain, that Robert describes in one of his introductions as one of her most extraordinary features and one of her distinguishing features amongst Russian writers. So she has that, and she can do that, and on the other hand, sometimes she screams, or sometimes her characters scream. And again, it's in one of his introductions that he lists the screams, the cries, the shouts, the yelps, the wails that appear across her works. And I would like to cite one that particularly struck me, which is in Witch, and we have the narrator, a Teffi-like character, wandering around a small provincial town in an unhappy marriage, and she hears the frantic scream of a bird. I'd already been told that this was the doctor's guinea hen wailing for her slaughtered mate. Such a cry of inconsolable despair above the dead little town was more than any human soul could bear. I remember coming home and saying to my husband, now I know why people hang themselves. He screamed, clutching his head in his hands. And is it that the fact that the guinea hen has lost her mate makes her think of suicide, or is it identification with the guinea hen who has lost her mate? Either way, it is an extraordinary example, again, of identification with animals. I would actually add another scream to Robert's list, at least I think it should make the short list, which is that Teffi recalls that when she was around about 5, she liked to draw, and she liked to draw her younger sister Lena. And the way she always started with these pictures of Lena was with a circle, and then she would fill it in with black, and that was Lena's mouth, because Lena cried a lot. And so this round black circle was the principal fact, and all the other features were just kind of secondary to that. And there we have it in visual form, this cry, this Teffian cry. And I will just finish on a rather somber note by saying that we all know that times are hard in this country, and that people are living through very tough things, and in some cases experiencing great hardship and great injustice. And so I'm kind of haunted by the fact that when I walk the streets and I hear, people chatting, and I hear the bells on bicycles, and I hear the buses sounds, and what I don't hear are screams. And I'm thinking, where are all the screams? They must be happening to some extent, although I know we're English and we tend not to do this kind of thing perhaps so much as Russians do, but I assume they do happen sometimes, and they happen behind closed doors. But Teffi voices these screams, and she helps me to be aware of them, even if they're not actually being voiced in the streets around me. Thank you.
So thank you, Catherine, for mentioning the guillotine. It's one of the articles, sketches that only surfaced fairly recently. She published quite a lot of mostly very black humor pieces in the Russian and Ukrainian press. So in her last year and a half, some in Moscow, but then also during her last months in Kiev and Odessa. And the Guillotine was one of those. It only surfaced fairly recently in a little Russian collection called Kontrrevolutionное письмо, counter-revolutionary letter. And I'm actually delighted to, that among the audience here is Polina Lavrova with the black hair, who I last met in Kiev. She published a very fine volume which included for the first time some of Teffi's very last pieces before she emigrated. So it's very pleasing to see Paulina again. The Guillotine, I don't see it as quite so extraordinary in Teffi's work because there are quite a number of equally dark pieces written at that time, but it does have one of the blackest anti-antisemitic jokes of Teffi's career. She was quite good at making fun of anti-Semitism. As a piece she wrote, a very sharp piece written during the First World War. It's a fruit of Teffi's time. She worked as a nurse for some time during a frontline nurse for a while. And one of the fruits of that period is her making fun of a very posh aristocratic woman who is very proud of having donated money or in some way supported a frontline hospital, and she's going to visit it, and she's heard two things about the hospital. One is that there was a very, very brave soldier there, a wounded soldier who has just been awarded the highest military medal, maybe the George Cross. But she's also heard that some Russian soldiers have been sort of evicted from their proper wards, while there's a Jew is been given a good place there, and then the story ends with her being completely floored because it turns out that the brave soldier who's been awarded a medal and the Jew are the same person, so she doesn't know what to make of that. And in the Guillotine, so when people are getting impatient with the queue, there was a bit of a scene in one of the queues. A nimble young man with dark hair had managed to jump the queue and get himself executed before those around him even knew what was happening. There was no end of fuss. people were shouting that bribes had changed hands. And wasn't that just typical of the Jews, always sneaking to the front of the queue? It was getting cold. We were bored. So something I've been thinking about the last couple of days is Teffi's ability to work on all kinds of different scales. So the story that the very first piece of hers that I translated, a colleague in the States suggested it to me, and it was one of the first stories that absolutely convinced me that it deserved to be included in the Penguin Anthology of Short Stories, Penguin Classics Anthology that I was then compiling. It's a story called Love, and it's a very, very delicate evocation of a young teenage girl, clearly Teffi herself, and the kind of crush that she develops on one of the Ukrainian women gardeners, a girl called Ganya. And it's full of beautiful, vivid details, but Teffi is brilliant in the way she evokes all the rapidly shifting feelings that the narrator, Teffi, has for this girl. So just two short extracts. So from the first page, and sorry, I got her age wrong. The narrator is 9 years old at this point. The morning, and it's spring, the morning of each long day began joyfully. Thousands of small rainbows in the soapy foam of the wash bowl. A new brightly coloured light dress. A prayer before the icon behind which the stems of pussy willow were still fresh. Tea on a terrace shaded by lemon trees that had been carried out from the orangery in their tubs. My elder sisters, black-browed and with long plaits, only just back from boarding school for the holidays and still unfamiliar to me. The slap of washing bats from the pond beyond the flower garden, where the women doing the laundry were calling out to one another in ringing voices. The languid clucking of hens behind a clump of young, still small-leaved lilac. Not only was everything new and joyful in itself, but it was, moreover, a promise of something still more new and joyful. The main event in the story is that the narrator wants to give a gift to this gardener, and she thinks, what better than an orange, because oranges are still, they're exotic and unusual. And because I adore oranges. They are round and golden like the sun, and beneath their peel are thousands of tiny pockets bursting with sweet, fragrant juice. An orange is a joy. An orange is a thing of beauty. And suddenly I thought of Ganka. She didn't know about oranges. Warm tenderness and pity filled my heart. Poor Ganka. She didn't know. I must give her one. So this goes badly wrong because she throws Ganka an orange, and Ganka doesn't know that one isn't supposed to eat the peel of the orange, so she bites into the peel and throws it away in disgust, and so it's all very tragic, if only on a small scale. So Teffi is, what is remarkable about her is that she's equally brilliant with her, what Ezra Pound referred to as the luminous details, on the story on this kind of very, very small scale, but also when she's dealing with much, much bigger matters. So when she arrived in Paris in 1921 or 22, she really did so in style, in terms of publications at least. There was a story titled Que Faire, French words, what to do, what is to be done. That was in the very first issue of one of the most important Russian language newspapers in Paris. And she, a bit later, there was a much, much grander publication, a very kind of really classy journal called Jar Ptitsa, that was sometimes published in Berlin, sometimes in France. It was very lavishly illustrated. You know, had all the top emigre artists were contributing to it. It's a kind of the same world as Diaghilev and the Ballet Russe, very, very classy and exotic. And Salavki, that Catherine has already mentioned, the story about the pilgrimage to the Solovyetsky monastery, that was the first item in the first issue of that. So she really did make her mark very quickly. And, you know, this ability to kind of capture a whole world through one luminous detail, she does utterly brilliantly with Que Faire. And this is very, very well translated by Claire Kitson, who was one of the contributors to our first Teffi collection. She lives in Bristol now, she'd probably otherwise be here. Que Faire. I heard tell of a Russian general, a refugee, who went out onto the Place de la Concorde and looked around. He looked up at the sky and around at the square, the houses, the shops, and the colourful, chattering crowd. He scratched the bridge of his nose and said, with feeling, "All this, ladies and gentlemen, is well and good. Even very well and good, all this. But, well, que faire? What is to be done? Faire's fair, but que bloody fair with it all." So in Russian, she's playing on the French que faire, and then the general repeats it, kind of Russifying it. Faire, you know, now in Russian letters, faire to que. So to is a kind of Russian emphatic particle. Que faire, faire to que. And this became a sort of motto. It was just endlessly repeated by the Russians in Paris at the time. And it's just utterly brilliant. It's got this, you know, it seems utterly simple, but it's got these huge subtexts. First of all, Nikolai Chernyshevsky's revolutionary novel, Что делать, what is to be done, generally is seen nowadays as a very tedious, earnest, early socialist novel, which was apparently immensely, had a huge influence on the young Lenin. He's supposed to have read it many, many times. Tolstoy also wrote a piece called Что делать, what is to be done. So she is alluding to all of these, to Tolstoy, Chernyshevsky, and Lenin. And, the implications are reversed. I mean, the speakers are reversed. This is a Russian Tsarist general rather than a revolutionary. And Chernyshevsky, Tolstoy, and Lenin all had no doubts as to what to be done. They were all men possessed of fanatical certainty. Whereas, this Russian general absolutely does not know what is to be done, and he's completely lost. He doesn't even really quite know what language to speak. So there's, it's just dense with reversals. She, throughout her career, has this extraordinary ability to seize on the right detail and to present a situation from an unexpected perspective. So, that Russian general is a kind of brilliant epitome, unexpected epitome of this new Russian town. Teffi actually calls it a garadok, a little town, a little Russian town within Paris. She shows an equally brilliant ability to seize on a small incident to epitomize a whole kind of period of history when in reality, obviously, communications during the war years weren't that good, and there were rumours that Teffi had died, and her obituary was published in a Russian language journal in the States. And Teffi found out about this. And she begins a piece written in August 1945, so Paris, fairly recently liberated. She begins a piece discussing the etiquette of, how as someone supposedly dead, does one write to the editor of a journal to say that one isn't dead? And, that no doubt in time, these etiquettes for such matters will be resolved, because there are, any number of us who, people think may have died. And then she begins to doubt, perhaps is it possible that she actually has died without quite realizing it, and that she is already in the other world? And then she kind of lists both the sort of personal, relatively, to her, at the time, huge difficulties of lack of food and heating and so on. But then, these end up being dwarfed by the fact that in this other world, they even lay on entertainment for us. And we're invited to go to the cinema. And what do they show us in the cinema? And she doesn't actually entirely spell this out, but it is quite clearly Soviet newsreels of Majdanek or Auschwitz. So Teffi uses this little silly incident of her obituary as a way of kind of really expressing her horror at all that has happened during the years of the war. Teffi is an immensely varied writer. She writes about all kinds of different themes and treats a huge number of different kinds of people. I'm reminded of Grossman's words about Chekhov, saying that Chekhov was, the first great Democrat who introduced people from all different classes into Russian literature. I feel Teffi actually does much the same. So she treats a huge number of different characters, immense range. Paradoxically, few writers have been more pigeonholed than Teffi. To this day, Russians still seem to value her for the stories she wrote in the first few years of her career, the kind of very light satirical sketches that she published in the journal Satyricon are very, very good, but they are very light. And a lot of, certainly when I was first reading and translating Teffi about 15 years ago, she was generally seen as a light humorist, which is, couldn't be further from the truth. But she was probably more than any other writer that I included in the Penguin Classics short story anthology, probably more than anyone else. She did excite controversy when I was asking people for advice, because I was, it was quite one of the joys of compiling an anthology is that because one's always got something to talk about with anyone. So what's your favourite Russian short story? And quite a lot of people, ranging from very eminent members of the Academy of Sciences to relatively not highly educated people. Quite a lot of people were strongly encouraging me to include Teffi, but also some people whose opinion I usually value were strongly against it, and accusing me of just feeling I've got to include my quota of women and that kind of thing, which is completely wrong. But she was very, very pigeonholed for a long time, and one of her darkest stories. The volume she wrote she published in 1916, A Lifeless Beast. That's really the first book of Teffi's that has a lot of very bleak and dark and serious stories, and she's one of the relatively few Russian writers to really treat the First World War at all adequately. And one of the stories there, Yavdokha, is a peasant woman, an illiterate peasant woman, who lives on her own. She's very much of a loner and quite eccentric. Well, I say alone. She lives with her pig, who she's very devoted to, and a letter arrives for her, which of course she can't read, and she has to struggle to get someone rather unwilling to read it to her, and she just cannot take in. She fails to take in, even when the letter is read to her, that this is a letter from her son's comrade at the front. It is actually a notification that her son has been killed in the war, in the First World War. And at the time, Russians were so used to thinking of Teffi as a comic writer that she was criticized in the press for making fun of this peasant woman, which is just the absolute opposite of the truth. She was treating this peasant woman with immense compassion. I'm going to sit down for a moment. And even when Teffi is treating her grandest themes, so in the very last story, the title story, And Time Was No More, this was written just a couple of years probably before her death. And Teffi was close to death a number of times in her life. She had serious heart trouble several occasions, and she nearly died of the Spanish flu in Kiev in 1918, 1919. But this last story is a kind of evocation of her opium-induced kind of haze and kind of dreams that she's having, imaginary conversations she's having with a figure called the huntsman in her kind of opium haze. And she, at times, is discussing, very serious religious questions with this dream figure, the huntsman. And so at one point she launches into quite a long, there's a page and a half monologue that she says to this figure about the world soul. But even here she's able to, she keeps, she never gets lost in abstractions. She's always able to find, the perfect detail to epitomize what she's speaking about. So, in this case, picking up a bit on what Catherine said earlier about Teffi and animals, she talks about the world soul being common to all people and animals. A dog can distinguish between good and evil every bit as well as a human being can. But a dog, of course, can't put any of this into words. Anyone who has carefully observed the life of animals knows that the moral law is inherent in them, just as in human beings. Which reminds me of a certain little hare. So now we're getting to the little detail which makes this so memorable. Reminds me of a certain little hare, a silly little woodland creature. Someone caught this hare, and it soon grew tame. It liked to stay close to its owners, and if they quarrelled, it always got terribly upset. It would run back and forth between the two of them, and it wouldn't calm down until they made up. The hare loved its friends and wished them to have a peaceful life. This was for their sake, not for the hare's, because their quarrels did not affect it directly. What upset the little wild beast was the suffering of others. The hare was a bearer of the world soul. This is how I feel about the world soul, and this therefore is how I feel about death. Death is a return to the whole, a return to the oneness. That little story about the hare particularly touches me because we once had a cat, a rather large, awkward cat. It wasn't. It wasn't. It was rather. It's rather unusual to say that a cat is badly coordinated, but this cat was rather badly coordinated, at least by cat standards. But this cat did exactly in the way that Teffi has just described. It did intervene in a row between myself and my wife. And it completely resolved. We both of us just burst out laughing. The cat yowled. The cat yowled very crossly and angrily. And it was quite clear what it was saying to us. We just couldn't carry on shouting at each other any longer after that. So anyway, thank you, Teffi, for that hair. And there is, I've mentioned Paulina. I'd also just like to mention that there's a lot that still isn't known about Teffi. She's not been, there hasn't been proper research done on all, on all the periodicals that in different countries, especially in France. Helen Stern just spoke to me at the beginning of this evening, saying that her grandmother's sister translated some stories by Teffi into German. This is completely new to me, as I'm aware of some of Teffi's work being published during her lifetime in France, and I think also in Italy, but I hadn't known of any German translations. As often with things to do with Russia, a few things get done in the world of publishing. A few things get done at an extraordinarily conscientious and excellent level. And then there's a lot of rather mediocre publishing, or worse than mediocre. And the two, there isn't much in between. So the story that I've mentioned, The Other World, her response to the obituary, that is, I encountered that in a volume published quite a long time ago, at least 15 years ago. It's just a volume of proceedings from an academic conference, and as far as I know, it hasn't been republished in any of the many Russian publications of Teffi's work, not even in a recent one which is entirely focused on Teffi's Paris publications. So there is still a lot more to be found out about Teffi, and I was gladdened recently to hear from one of the Teffi researchers in Moscow that they are starting work in the Academy of Sciences on a kind of serious, scholarly, complete Teffi. But that'll be a long way until it's completed. So anyway, my thanks to Pushkin Press for taking up Teffi so enthusiastically, and to the New York Review of Books for doing the same in the States, and to Catherine for her reviews and coming here this evening, and to Paulina for publishing some of her work for the first time. And thank you all for coming, and please feel free to ask questions of either of us, or also possibly of Paulina.
Thank you so much for this and for bringing Teffi to the English language world. I mean, I lived in Moscow in 1990 with a very, very literary family, and they never mentioned Teffi to me. They gave me the canon of Russian literature, and it seems extraordinary that she isn't better known. And I just wondered whether you could say something more about her trajectory in coming into sort of, being better known in Russia, and how she was received. Because was it, misogyny? And I mean, there seems to be so few female writers of that era that have had much fame. So I just wondered if you could say something more about that.
Yeah, I mean, the ups and downs of her reputation are very, very extreme. I mean, she was fantastically famous in the years before the revolution. I mean, she really was a superstar. Lenin appreciated her work, and so did the Tsar. She had her name on boxes of chocolates. She was in the much smaller but not so small world of the Russian emigre world, and that did span the world. I mean, it included Russian communities in China and so on. She was immensely famous in that emigre world, but didn't get much translated. The Russian Paris was very distinct from Paris, from French Paris. Partly that was a political issue. Most literary people in 1930s Paris were very left-wing, and still more so after the war. Famous in a limited world. And then after the war, I mean, the emigre world just fell apart completely, because it's, in a way, the Red Army's victory sort of kind of undermined the kind of moral, very much undermined the standing of the emigres still more. So, I mean, Bunin, Ivan Bunin, who has won a Nobel Prize in the 1930s, I think about a dozen people attended his funeral in the early 1950s. He died shortly before Teffi. Emigre literature just, there was suddenly nobody to value it. I mean, when I was a student, it seemed desperately important to try to understand the Soviet Union, so why bother with emigres? I think that was a bit different. I met someone who of my age who had been introduced to Teffi at an American university, but anyway, I mean, I didn't know of her until I started compiling the anthology. Quite a number of different things coincided to kind of undermine her reputation. The collapse of interest in the emigre world, not being taken seriously because she was a woman, and not being taken seriously because people obstinately went on imagining she was a light humorist. All those things. She's been published quite a lot in Russia in the last 20 years, but as I said, not always all that well published. So, I mean, the story Salavki, which we've mentioned several times, is one of the stories that she most valued. Again, one of her most serious stories. That was missing from a huge number of the sort of quite large 500 or 600 page selected Teffis that were being published all the time. So there are quite a lot of different answers to that, but it is changing.
I just wondered whether there were places that you really struggled with in the translation, because one of the hardest things to translate is wit and humour. And I just wondered if there were any particular dilemmas you came across.
I think it probably probably be quicker to try and find places which we didn't struggle with. I mean, it was. She's extraordinary. She's as difficult as anyone I've ever translated. Again and again, I'd have the experience of looking at a draft which, seemed a perfectly accurate, good draft, and what on earth had gone wrong? Why was it so completely dead? And why was, the original was witty and graceful? What was it that had got lost? And it was very, very hard to see that. And it was actually something I once received a letter from one of my editors that somebody else, another translator, this is quite a while ago, was trying to get the publishers to, New York Review of Books, to publish Teffi, and this other translator had written in her covering letter, a lot of Teffi is dated, but there are some stories that it's possible to refresh. Oh my God! I had so many moments of thinking, why was Teffi's language so fresh? Why did my language seem so stale in comparison? I mean, she just has a fantastic sense of rhythm, of grace, she just writes beautifully, but it's very, very hard. I mean, this is something I say again and again. She's one of a great many 20th century Russian prose writers who either began as poets or carried on writing poetry throughout their career. So, that list includes Platonov, whose first publication was a book of poetry. It includes, very obviously, Nabokov. It includes Bunin, who carried on writing poetry throughout his life. I'm sure, now I'm getting tired and names are slipping out of my mind, but Bunin, Nabokov, Teffi, Platonov. I mean, the number that... Sorry? Andrei Bielay, yes, thank you. I mean, the ones, even Solzhenitsyn wrote one of his earlier works, was a long poem that he composed in the Gulag when he didn't have access to writing materials. The number of great writers, I think Sholokhov and Grossman are probably the two unquestionably great writers who didn't write poetry. And I mean, in several cases, Teffi's poetry, I don't think is that great. And Platonov's early poetry is interesting, but I don't think we'd be that interested in it if it weren't for what he wrote later. But nevertheless, that ability to kind of really weigh every syllable and to use kind of very unobtrusive alliteration and assonance and so on, it's there in all of Teffi's prose. So yes, I mean, the answer is just, rereading things again and again and just, batting every sentence backwards and forwards between, myself and my wife when we were working together, trying to find some way to bring the wit alive. I mean, it's not a great, comic writers, especially, comic people doing comic sketches for television and the theatre, very, very often they work in pairs, and there's a good reason for that. That it's quite sort of hard to be witty on one's own. One's got to at least be able to imagine a partner, but if you've got a real partner who's willing to play that role, it makes it a lot easier. So thank you for that question. Ilona.
It's interesting that you mentioned the difficulty of working on Teffi, because with Teffi particularly, more than perhaps some of your other translations, the feeling I get is delight. The translator's delight in the sentences and in the language. This comes through to me more than, the Platonov and the Grossman, in a way. And translators will occasionally confess to working on an author whom they can sort of organically hear, whose syntax and sense of humor and kind of word choices really mirror what they hear in their head, which makes the whole process delightful. And you've had such a long career. You've translated Platonov and Grossman and Pushkin and Teffi. And I wonder if for you, there is an author whom you just hear in that way, and you know that you'll get to the solution eventually because they're very close to your own inner voice.
I don't think there's ever been... there are a few sentences of Platonov that do defeat me, and I know that I will never come up with anything as good as what he's written. I don't think there are any... I think with Teffi we did always feel we got there in the end, I think. And she is, she is a joy to translate. And it is extraordinary how very many people, not aware of this, but a great many reviewers came up with very, very similar sentences. So I remember Nick Lazard reviewing our first collection. He wrote something like, "Pushkin Press has done it again, made me fall in love with someone I'd never known before." Erika Wagner, who reviewed one of the books reviewed Memories for the Times, I think. Teffi is a courageous companion for anyone's life. People seem to really, she does have this extraordinary ability to sort of evoke a sense of intimacy with the reader. It's another absolute paradox, because there are a huge number of crucially important things in her life which she kept very, very secret indeed, but she makes the reader feel intimate with her. I'll just share one more thing, which is I was slightly ashamed but also delighted by an email I received a few days ago. There's someone whose first name is Anil, who I know very little about except that they live in India, and they'd invited me to do a podcast, which I haven't yet done. It got delayed because of Anil's illness. But after inviting me to do the podcast and then exchanging a few messages, this person told me that they'd started translating Teffi into Telugu, and I was ashamed to have to look up Telugu on Wikipedia. It's actually it's the 14th most widely spoken language in the world. It's a Southern Indian language, and this Anil will be translating from English rather than from Russian, which may not be ideal, but I don't know how many Telugu speakers know Russian. But anyway, I was very pleased when after a week or so, this Anil wrote back saying they're translating the story called Kishmish, which is another very short story, and Anil recognized that. It's strange, a very simple story, a very simple 5-page story about a child, but it's terribly difficult to translate. And I thought, good, it was, this person's getting there.
we have time for a few more questions.
Hello again, my name is Paulina, as Robert said, sorry for my English. Yes, and as Robert mentioned, I have a publishing house in Kiev, but what he didn't say that originally I'm from St Petersburg, Russia. I moved to Kiev in 2006, and I started like in a few years my publishing house, the first book was a book by Teffi, yeah, and we mostly took her stories which connected like Kiev, Odessa, this time, like memories, little bit from memories, and like and then how me and Robert met, because we found some stories which were like unknown before, like they're not very, maybe they're not very significant, but they're interesting because it's like, you know, it's like it was for the first time published. And the only thing I want to mention that we moved with my daughter to Great Britain September 2022. And first months, they like were really difficult for us because we weren't prepared for, you know, this movement. And, you know, we changed places, we always was with our suitcases, and we lived with our friends, we rented like short rents, some like rooms and everything. And there was some sad days, sad times, sad hours for me. But I told myself, you love Teffi so much, so maybe you should live a little bit in her stories, you know, be part of your stories. This is real love, not like love from the distance, but let's live a little bit in her stories. So, what? And what I want to say that Teffi, like I like Averchenko, of course, I like many people from this, you know, her circle. But what is important in stories, Teffi, for me, that yes, there's some sorrow, sadness, and these terrible stories.
Keep your microphone close to your mouth.
So, sorrow and sadness, but still there's so much place for light and love and kindness. And she's very kind to people, yes, and she loves people. She loves people. I mean, many, you know, many people who like, many writers who wrote, even Buin, they're like very, sometimes they're very strict to people, but she loves people, and it gives hope. That's all. Yeah.
Thank you for saying that. That's an important point. I'll just mention that I went to Kiev really just to kind of try and visit the places that Teffi mentions in her memoirs.
Any other questions? Or well, a huge thank you to Robert and Catherine for joining us tonight. That was a delight to listen to. And thank you to everyone who's joined us tonight in person and online as well. Our bar will be open next door if you'd like to stay with us for a drink. And of course, we have lots of the new Teffi translation for sale downstairs, as well as Robert's previous translations of Teffi. So thank you again.